Hello, my name is Jean Chandler. I'm a researcher from the historical fencing community and was a fencing instructor for about 20 years. I conduct research with a focus on historical martial arts, medieval military history, and especially urban communities in Northern and Central Europe. Today I'm going to talk to you about a little known war between England and a handful of cities from the Hanseatic League called the Anglo Hanseatic War, which took place roughly between 1470 and 1474. I'm going to kind of go over the origins and the context of this little war and why it was actually fairly significant. We're going to talk a little bit about merchants, which were the basis of the Hanseatic League, and how they made a living. We're going to talk about warfare in this period and the nature of feuding and collateral damage. We're going to talk a bit about trade on the high seas and what naval warfare was really like in the 15th century, what it was evolving into. We're going to talk about a place called the Steel Yard in London, which was a Hanseatic outpost inside of the city of London in England. And we're going to talk specifically in a little bit of detail about some of the warships that were involved in this war, and in particular, one sea captain that was known as the Old Seabird. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the capture of a really important and beautiful work of art that took place in this war and how it all ended up and sort of what happened next. So, the origins of this are in a type of warfare that is not something we see a lot in the summaries of the history that we get. There's a famous quote by Winston Churchill that history is written by the victor. And that it's kind of a cynical take that I think a lot of Americans really like, and it's repeated all the time. And in a way, it's kind of a way to dismiss the very idea of history. Like, oh, history is inevitably corrupted. Everybody's going to just push their own advantage and their own preferred narrative and everything, kind of like everything in the media in the U.S. and in the West today. But real history is not a matter of just looking at official narratives. Real history comes from private letters and invoices and receipts and wills and lawsuits, business records, internal government reports, audits, things like that. So really this idea that history is written by the victor is more a matter of the summary of history, the cliff notes of history that most people don't go beyond. But if you do go beyond, you can find these kind of records, especially when it comes to cases of what I call town versus crown, which is where these cities, especially the free cities and the city-states that were still a really important part of the world, important part of the economy, the politics, and warfare in the Middle Ages, whenever they were fighting with kingdoms, and especially when they won, as they surprisingly often did, this is not something that the kingdom itself or anybody that sort of works for the kingdom is going to want to talk about a whole lot. You're not going to find Shakespeare plays about the Anglo Hanseatic War, but you can find a lot of data and records about this war in the internal archives and records of the cities that were involved. And you can find some in England too. It's just that it's just not something that's in the summaries. It's not something that's emphasized. This video is going to be a part of a series where I'm going to cover cases where towns were fighting kingdoms, and we're going to kind of see how that went, and we'll get into the nature of medieval warfare and the kind of the advantages that each side of that type of conflict had, because these were pretty important conflicts that helped really shape the way Europe developed in the later Middle Ages and in the early part of the early modern era. So before we get to that, kind of take a quick look at how merchants made a living. There's an interesting split between the legal systems in the Middle Ages. There were multiple kinds of jurisdictions in the Middle Ages. There's church law, there's princely law, there's sort of lower-ranking law of nobility, something called Länrecht and Landsrecht in the German world. There's urban law. There's traditional tribal law that was still lingering. That was the law of the common people, and and there was also laws that were specific to universities and to the church and different elements of the church and so forth. And these didn't always understand each other or acknowledge each other. In fact, when it came to towns and princely aristocrats, especially monarchs, there's a weird split between how they see each other. The princely monarchs did not really recognize the towns in a lot of respects, or town citizens in their courts, but they made exceptions. So in general, they don't necessarily acknowledge that. But a lot of times, monarchs and princes, including princes of the church, would form alliances with powerful cities, and they actually sometimes had a pretty cozy relationship. But if they weren't getting along, there was a lot of room for trouble because it was not that easy to negotiate your way out of disputes. One of the sources of these disputes was the fact that in order for there to be commerce, merchants had to travel all over the place. They were traveling from town to town mostly, but they were traveling from outside of Europe and then all the way to the remote fringes of Europe, a lot of which was in the West. Today we think of of Western Europe as sort of the more advanced part of Europe, but in the Middle Ages, that was not really the case. The most advanced part of Europe was really Italy and various other hotspots of urbanization in Flanders, the Rhineland, in Catalonia, Bohemia, parts of Poland. But places like England and France and Spain were war-torn, and they were more rural and more agricultural based in their economies. And so they were relying for a lot of what they used, including most of the weapons that they used in warfare. They were buying these from places like Italy, Germany, Flanders. We have, as a result of a lot of Victorian tropes and of the summaries of history that we got, including some very good, well-done summaries that we got during the Victorian era, but which had certain omissions, certain emphasis, and in these kinds of summarized histories, official histories, and semi-official histories that were favored by the monarchs, you didn't want to write something that the king or the queen didn't like in the Victorian era, in the 18th or 19th century, let's say. And part of what comes out of that is the idea of commoner merchants and trading cities as being sort of frustrating, pathetic, but somehow at the same time in some mysterious, incomprehensible way, also powerful. And we always see depictions of merchants in particular as fat, bald, and weak. This is just so consistent. Game of Thrones, there was, they showed merchants a few times. They're always just absolutely obese and pathetic and sort of conniving and deceitful. And this is not really what merchants appear to be in this era. These were people that had to hit the road. So they're either getting in a caravan and traveling on roads all the way across the land in very long distances and having to face bandits and brigands and robber knights and sometimes clashing with even, relatively powerful princely aristocrats and so on. These people were very resourceful and tough. Or they were on the high seas, which is what we're talking about today. I just want to very quickly, though, just show a couple of images, because I'm a big believer, perhaps to a fault, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So this guy is called Oswald Krell, and he had the good fortune to run into Albrecht Dürer, and he had some money, and he hired him to paint a portrait. This is a really wonderful portrait that I like because I think it helps dispel the myth of the bald and fat merchant, if not anything else. Because this guy's definitely not bald. Look at the hair. I mean, that's magnificent head of hair there. And it's a really interesting painting. Krell asked Dürer apparently to depict him as he really was. He didn't want to. When you got a portrait painted, obviously you could have it. You could have the Instagram filter of the era put on it to where it looked a lot better than you really did, or you could kind of show the person for what they're like. And Krell had a reputation of being a bit argumentative, a little bit hard-headed, kind of a troublesome guy that didn't take any grief from anybody, let's say. And you can see that in his face here a little bit. You can also see an interesting detail on the flanks of his portrait, where on either side there's these sort of furry guys with clubs and shields, And these are coats of arms of his family and his wife's family, and these both depict something that the Germans called the Wildermann. And this is essentially it's the medieval equivalent of Bigfoot. And what it represents in this painting is the hazards of the road, the random element of the very dangerous forests and hills that this guy was having to cross, because he was a merchant with the Grand Ravensburg Company, the Gross Ravensburger Hanseagesellschaft, which was a combined. It was a company, but not exactly like a corporation. It's kind of more like an alliance of about 50 to 80 individual merchants from roughly a dozen families from all over Central Europe, where they were kind of like cooperating militarily, economically, and in terms of intelligence. Like they were learning things and sharing information, and they were a very powerful trading company, which is not very well known outside of Germany. Apparently in Germany there's multiple historical novels, all kinds of translations and stuff, but there's almost nothing in English about these people. I will have a link at the end if you want to try to follow up. The next merchant I just wanted to show here is, these guys are favorites of mine, are Jan and Sweryn Boner. So these guys were merchants from Krakow. They had originally from a family from the Alsace region in between France and Germany, and they had moved into Silesia in what's now southern Poland. Back in the day, it was sort of a contested region that was under Bohemia, which is the Czech area. But these guys moved to Krakow, where they became prominent merchants. Jan was the first one that got set up, and then Sweryn was his nephew, and they became instrumental in the power of Poland. The Polish king, the Polish-Lithuanian king, recognized the value of having free cities, and they recognized the importance of merchants and the great benefits that merchants could bring in terms of commerce and economic development. And Jan Boner became an important courtier for the King of Poland. He was put in charge of mines and paper mills, and was just a very important guy. But more important to the point here is he has a wonderful suit of armor, and he just looks butch as hell. Both of these guys do. But in particular, we have a great depiction of Sweryn Boner. So I just wanted to get that across. These are merchants, but these guys are also knighted. So they're not, and they're common born. They're not nobles, but they're probably going to also have titles by the end of their life because of the service to the crown. But this merchant class was definitely a rival to the aristocrats of the era, and were not necessarily to be trifled with. So part of the nature of warfare in the Middle Ages, and this applied both to the merchant estate to some extent, but especially to the aristocratic estate, was that because of the balance of military power that kind of favored the defense, because a fortification was hard to overcome, because fortifications and cannons and firearms and such had become very well developed, and it was just easier to use them from inside of a fortification. So somebody on the defensive, somebody that was a little bit weaker in a conflict, could just hold up in their cities, their fortified cities and their castles, and you end up in sort of a boycott situation where one side is trying to prevent any commerce from going on, and maybe practicing scorched earth, burning fields and things like that. And what happened a lot of times with the merchants was that they would get caught up in feuds that were going on between kingdoms and between princely rulers, maybe like the Duke of Mecklenburg versus the King of Denmark, for example, which would be relevant to our case here. And the Hanseatic League was a cartel of cities in what's now northern Germany, northern Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Sweden, and was closely connected to cities in Flanders and the Netherlands, and had trade links that went all the way into Russia and Central Asia and far into the West. And they had an outpost in London, which was the sort of the spark of this war that we're talking about today. But I kind of want to go back a little bit and look at a timeline of conflict that was going on between the Hanseatic League, which were these merchants and the merchant cities that they lived in, versus the Kingdom of Denmark, which originally was their main sort of opponent. And they were fighting over a little bit of geography that is called the Øresund. This is the the channel, probably the best navigable channel that passes between what is today Denmark and Sweden. In the Middle Ages, this was Denmark on both sides of the strait, and on what's now the Swedish side was very important for the Hanseatic League, because this was where there was a really important herring fishery, and the Hans kind of got started by shipping salt from German salt mines in German-made barrels, and coming into this annual herring fishery that was going on at the Scania market. It's a lot like the way people go to Alaska to fish or go on crab boats these days. It was sort of a frenzy, get-rich-quick kind of situation that really worked out very well for the Hans. But Denmark felt like anybody that was passing through that strait, the Øresund, owed them a tax, a pretty big tax, and the Hans objected to that, and they wanted to kind of negotiate it. But the King of Denmark and a series of kings of Denmark for over almost 100 years just said, I'm not negotiating with commoners. You people are commoners. You're basically peasants to me. You do what I say, and it's my way or the highway. In the middle of the 14th century, the head of the Hanseatic League nominally was this town called Visby, which is more or less a Swedish town in the big, mysterious island of Gotland. And Visby was a little more international of a city than what the Hans became later. It was very much a mix. There were Swedish and sort of Baltic and Polish and German and other Scandinavian people there that were traders, and they had a military wing, but it wasn't the most aggressive militarily. Each of these towns sort of has its own personality, which is worth keeping in mind. And they were getting into conflicts with Denmark, and they were kind of coming out on top enough times that in utter frustration, the Danish king invaded Gotland. And a lot of people, if you know anything about military history in the Middle Ages, you've probably heard of the Battle of Visby, which was a battle that took place between the king of Denmark and a bunch of peasants that were the rural people that were living outside of the city. The city itself decided not to fight, which was maybe a huge mistake. But the peasants were wiped out. The city tried to negotiate a deal with the king, and he kind of let them off the hook. This is a fanciful depiction of what's called the Ransom of Visby, where he came into the town and took a huge amount of wealth from the city, and as you see, being piled up here. I love this painting. It's not what Visby looked like in the 14th century. This is really much more like 15th century Hanseatic town like Lubeck would look like. But I love the prince there and his glowering knights, and you can see there's like a Jewish guy on the right-hand side. In the foreground, there's the archetypical burghers that you're supposed to identify with, him and his wife, and they're just grief-stricken because they're having to give away all their wealth. But more importantly for Visby, they let this Danish king blow a hole in the wall of the city. The city was fairly well fortified, and he blew up a bunch of the fortifications, and they never really recovered from that. What ended up happening is the Hanseatic League shifted in its emphasis, and the new power was the city of Lubeck. Lubeck is a town in what's now northern Germany, close to Denmark, and Lubeck had a different kind of personality as a community than Visby did. Lubeck was much more warlike, and they, in the aftermath of this destruction of Visby, Lubeck launched what became known as the Danish Hanseatic War, 1361 to 1371, and they formed a coalition of these trading towns that became called the Confederation of Cologne. And initially the war didn't go so well, but over time, the Hans kept adjusting their approach. They put together a big fleet, and a city councilor and Burgermeister, more or less the mayor of Lubeck, led an expeditionary force onto Danish land. And while all the guys were on the land, their fleet was attacked by the Danish fleet, and a lot of them were sunk. And then they had to sort of slink back to Lubeck. And the citizens were so angry that they had the Burgermeister killed. He was executed for that. The next Burgermeister was a lot more successful, did not leave his ships, managed to corner the Danish fleet and destroy them. And in 1371, there was a treaty which basically gave all these assets, including Scania, this part of southern Sweden, to the Hans. The Hans got control over all that. There was also unintended consequence in that a pirate confederation was born out of privateers that had been involved in that war. And that's something I'll get into later. But they're relevant in sort of the next part of the military history of the Hans, because this group, which was called the Victual Brothers, became a major headache for the Hanseatic League, even though they started out as their own allies against Denmark, but they turned into this giant gang of pirates with little enclaves all along the Baltic shore and various little towns and rural areas, and they were attacking ships right and left, and they were ruthlessly killing the crews. And the Hanseatic League, in conjunction with the Teutonic Knights, drove those people out of Gotland, where they had become infesting, and they were associated with the now somewhat wrecked city of Visby. And the Hans kind of finished them off in 1400 with a big battle in the mouth of the Elbe River, in which the forces of Hamburg had built a special ship they called the Bunte Kuh, which meant the painted cow, because that was a kind of a thing in that region where they would, in certain festivals, they would take a cow and paint it all different colors. So as sort of a weird medieval joke, they painted this ship, as you can see in this depiction, a bunch of different colors. Now this depiction shows a multi-masted ship. That's probably not what the Bunte Kuh looked like. We'll get into that in a second. But they faced the fleet of the Victual Brothers, and their flagship, which was called the Mad Dog, and supposedly, according to legend, they snuck out early in the morning before the battle and managed to sabotage the rudder of the Mad Dog in the middle of the fog. And this is a theme. You'll read sort of descriptions of to help explain Hanseatic victories that involve stuff like this quite a lot going forward. But long story short was they defeated the pirate fleet and they executed the pirate leaders. And again, this is something I'll talk about a little later. War then ended up flaring up with Denmark once more. And once again, we had a case where the Hans was initially defeated, but then adapted and then came back. So in 1427, things came to a head, and a Hanseatic fleet that was at the time allied with Duke of, I think it was the Duke of Mecklenburg. It was one of the princes in northern Germany, and the Duke was in charge. And they attacked the Danish city of Copenhagen. The King of Denmark left, and he left his English-born wife in charge of the defenses. And either she or some of her advisors came up with the really smart idea of creating what they call floating batteries, because this is a time when warships, naval combat was really mostly a matter of shooting some missiles at each other and then one ship boarding another ship and they get on and have like a sword fight. But cannons and firearms were getting more and more prominent, and the challenge was really that where do you put the cannon on the ship? And in this case, the solution was basically to build barges or rafts, and you could put quite big cannons on those. And so the Queen of Denmark had this done, or her advisors did, or whoever came up with the idea, and they fought off the Hanseatic fleet. So the fleet went back to Lubeck. They kind of had a little falling out with the Duke of Mecklenburg, and they refitted the fleet. They came back with their own floating batteries, which they towed, which was in the form of old Hans ships that they kind of hollowed out, and they put big guns on them, and they just towed these with them and then blasted the Danish fleet to pieces and bombarded Copenhagen and forced the Danes to back down. So what was going on essentially in the 14th century into the sort of mid-15th century was that the Hans was getting more powerful and had really come to dominate Denmark. And Denmark, being a kingdom, was in a world that dealt in court and ambassadorships between nobles, where it was a little bit easier, even though their rivals were other kingdoms, it was a little bit easier for kingdoms to communicate and strike deals with other kingdoms. And they had a tendency to have a lot more confusion and strife and animosity when they were dealing with towns and coalitions of towns. So Denmark was often allied with England and also with the Duchy of Burgundy. which was usually an ally with England in the war between the Hundred Years' War between England and France, and those merchants wanted to get into the Baltic, which was sort of the lake of the Hanseatic League. The Hans didn't want them coming in there as competition, and the reason everybody wanted to get into the Baltic was because this was one of the ways that you could get Silk Road goods, and it was also a way that you could get to places like Finland and the rural parts of Sweden, where you could get furs and all kinds of forest products, and the wood that you used to make ships, all kinds of stuff like that. But really, especially, it was there's also amber and some other valuable things that are kind of unique to this area. But and fish was another really important commodity. But really, the cash draw was the Silk Road stuff. It would be the spices and the silk textiles that are coming ultimately from China and India and Persia and places like that. And this was one of the outlets. It was coming through the Russian cities like Veliki Novgorod and Tver and Pskov, and then going from there to Hanseatic cities that were in Livonia, which is now the Baltic states, so places like Riga and Tallinn, and they were outlets that were, where this fantastically valuable stuff was. So there were merchants that were trying to come from England and from Denmark and sometimes from France and Burgundy that were trying to go through the Øresund, but the Hans didn't want to let them do that. And on the other hand, the Hans had outposts in the Low Countries. They had a major outpost in Bruges. They had a big outpost in Bergen in Norway, and they had this place called the Steelyard in London. They also had a little bit smaller outposts in several other British or English cities, in York and in Boston and Lynn and a few other towns. They had these special outposts. So these are called kontor. Which literally means counting house, but they were basically warehouses and kind of hotels and a little bit fortified enclaves that the Hans merchants, who were mostly German speaking, but I think we can say were a little bit international. There were some of them that were really Flemish, some of them were Polish, some of them were Swedish, some were Hungarian. They were from all over the place, Bohemians. But mostly German-speaking, and they would have their own little enclaves in these places, and they would kind of keep themselves a little bit aloof, although the one in London was a fairly important part of the city, and London really needed the trade that came from these people. In fact, this is a picture of a famous picture by Hans Holbein of a merchant that a lot of people always assume is either a British merchant or a British nobleman, but this is actually a Hanseatic merchant, a German-speaking guy from the Steelyard. So to give you an idea what these people looked like. Want to veer into, before we get into this beginning of the war, just what naval warfare was like in the 15th century. So especially in the beginning, it's really about boarding. One ship basically barges into the other ship, and the crew runs over the gunwales, and they fight with swords until one side gives up, and they try to capture the other ship. Sometimes they're burning ships, so there's a lot of pyrotechnic weaponry, including kind of quasi-flamethrowers that the Byzantines were using. There were firearms, bows, crossbows, all of which were getting more and more effective as time went on. So the firearms were quite primitive in the 14th century, but even by the early 15th century, you're starting to have both better firearms and cannon, as well as better powder. That the gunpowder they were creating, or the precursor, the black powder that they were creating at the time, was getting more efficient. They had figured out how to separate the potassium nitrate from the calcium nitrate, so a little bit of moisture in the air didn't ruin the powder. And that meant that they were relying on guns a lot more, but they were still essentially, the goal was to take the ship and the cargo of the enemy ship. And a lot of times the warfare is economic. It's like enforcing a boycott as part of a sort of physical, violent side of a lawsuit. And there was lots of collateral damage, because what that meant is you're trying to say, for example, I don't want any ships trading with London because I'm in a war with England. So anybody that's trading with London is fair game. And if you show up and you've got a nice ship full of really nice cargo, I'm probably going to take it and say that I'm within my legal rights because I have declared war or declared a feud with this place. But then a lot of times people whose cargo is confiscated, whose ships are confiscated, whose people are basically kidnapped, they don't appreciate that. This, in fact, was the origin of a lot of the strife between the merchants and the robber knights in continental Europe, in Central Europe especially. But the merchants also did the same thing sometimes. In the case of the Anglo Hanseatic War, they very much did. When we're looking at town versus crown conflicts, there's a technological and military edge in different types of warfare. So in open field warfare, especially cavalry warfare, any princely army has a big advantage over the towns. The town soldiers are going to be mostly gunners and marksmen, like with crossbows, and they'll have some pikemen and such, but they'll generally be hiring mercenaries to form their ground armies. And mercenaries became a little more effective during the 15th century and were forced to be reckoned with. But the kingdoms, the princely armies, were really good at cavalry warfare, and they had large cavalry armies that were very hard to deal with. And nevertheless, they were defeated in the field sometimes, but that was really where their advantage was. The kingdoms, of course, also have a much larger population, so they can have a much bigger army in theory. And a lot of times, princely rulers would gang up on towns. When one princely ruler was having a feud with a town, other ones would join in. Now, the opposite is true as well, that whenever towns got into a feud with a kingdom, they would make alliances with other towns, and they would try to also make alliances with other princes, which they sometimes were able to do because most princes had rivals in their own estate. Towns were very small in this era, so the towns that were involved in this war, Danzig, Hamburg, Lubeck, Bremen, these cities had maybe between 15 to 30,000 people, and you might say that they might have another 5 or 10,000 people that they were kind of subjects of the city in the hinterland, but it's very small populations, and whereas a kingdom could have much larger, and even the population of the royal capitals like London was a much bigger city than any of these. London was maybe 100,000, 150,000 people, and Paris was similarly much larger, but they were different. They were very different people, type of places. So these cities like Lubeck and Hamburg and Danzig were free cities, and they were self-managed. They were autonomous. They had their own little councils that created their policy, and they were centers of innovation. So because of this, they had kind of an advantage on certain technologies. Their fortifications tended to be better and more advanced. Their armor was better. This is, in fact, a kingdom like England or France bought most of their armor from cities in Italy and Germany. Same for a lot of the more sophisticated weapons like crossbows, firearms, cannons, and crucially ships and boats. So for most of the 14th and 15th century, naval architecture technology was way ahead in the towns, in these maritime towns, than it was in the kingdoms. However, there was a shift that was starting to happen in the 15th century as trade was opening up in the Atlantic, and that really focused on Portugal. The Portuguese, famously, at least it's somewhat debated how, exactly what it meant, but they had created something called the School of Navigation under Henry the Navigator, the Prince of Portugal. And the Portuguese were pretty secretive about this, but in the mid-15th century, they started creating some new types of ships. So the ships that the round ships that were being used by merchants, that were the sailing ships, as opposed to the rowed galleys that you see much more of in the Mediterranean. The round ships were mostly what's called a cog. There was another type called a hulk, but most of these had a single mast and a square sail. So they could sail downwind, they could sail a little bit across the wind, but they couldn't sail into the wind. Whereas the caravel and the carrack, which were these new types of ships that the Portuguese invented for sailing around in the much rougher seas of the Atlantic, had a lateen sail, which is the triangular sail that you see on modern sailboats, and that comes from the Arabs. The Portuguese recognized the value of this, so they have a triangular lateen sail as well as the large square sails, and they'll have multiple masts, so 2 or 3 or 4 masts, usually 2 or 3 at this point.
But these ships were more maneuverable, and they could actually sail downwind because you can tack if you know anything about sailing with the help of the lateen sail. So there was a sort of a weird tipping point that was a dangerous moment for the towns in terms of their technological advantages, but they were still, when you compare to France and England, the Hans cities, and the same thing is true for the maritime republics of Italy, Genoa, Venice, and so on. They were more advanced in the technology of sailing and in the culture, and we might say the training that goes along with it. And finally, the towns also had a bit of an advantage in money and diplomacy because they had more ready cash. Princes, in theory, had more money than any of the towns, but their money is tied up in land and it's tied up in livestock and so forth. Whereas the cities are doing trade all day long, and they're doing manufacturing. They're producing lots of stuff that they're selling, beer and textiles and armor and weapons and all kinds of other things, and they get cash for that. So they've got ready money or liquid assets that they can quickly turn into cash. So it's easier for them to hire mercenaries and so forth. So getting into the naval architecture, like I said, the Bremer cog, the theory is it comes from Bremen, was the first place to invent it, and sometime in the 14th century, was this very effective trading ship. It was very simple. It's just a big kind of a round shape. It's got what's called a clinker hull, which is the same kind of overlapping hull. The wooden structure of the hull is made out of planks that are overlapping, and that lets the boat flex. They're kind of designed to be able to go into estuaries and rivers. There's another vessel called a hulk, which was developed in the Low Countries in what's now Holland and Belgium. There's another one called the Schnig, which meant different things in different time periods. The earliest versions of the Schnig that we can see images of look sort of like a type of Viking ship, and later ones have these sweeps that look very odd. They called them Eiderschnige, which meant these little. They were basically keels that could be put into the water, so you could go into shallow water, or if you wanted to go into deeper water, you could put these little keels down. But they look sort of like duck wings, but we don't really know what I at least don't know what a Schnige looks like in this particular era. But they were used a lot by the Hanseatic League and a lot of their and a lot by these cities in a lot of their victories. So they were a little bit smaller, a little more agile trading ships. And the cog itself changed between the 14th and the 15th century. So the early cogs were really just trading ships, and then they started making warships. So they would build fore and aft castle. I think the aft castle came first, and then they eventually would. So you'll have to see these built-up parts on the front and back of the ship. And this is where you have your marksmen and your cannon. And this continued to be an issue for warfare in this era was that even though cannon had gotten better, you didn't have anywhere to put the cannon because they hadn't figured out the process of putting the little gun ports in the side of the hull yet. That came in the 16th century. A lot of the fighting that happened was happening in naval warfare, was happening in estuaries and around ports. They didn't too often run into each other in the high seas. This is rare, and that continued to be rare all the way well into this age of sail. Sometimes it happened, but it was more often that they would run into each other, in the mouth of a river or near a port. And as I mentioned before, there's an exchange of missile fire. They're going to shoot at each other. Sometimes there's fire, incendiary weapons. They had much more sophisticated incendiary weapons than you typically see in movies. It's not just like a rag with pitch on it. They had this sort of phosphorus type pyrotechnics that will burn even if they're underwater, and they could shoot those into the enemy ship if they want to fire the ship, but they may not want to because you may want to get the cargo, you may want to get the ship. Ultimately, it comes down to boarding actions, and you can see in these depictions from Fazar and from some modern depictions here that very bloody, dangerous, scary, and yeah, they wore armor. They wore armor like knights, so if you fell into the water, you're done. You're not going to be swimming. I mean, the armor's not as bulky as people assumed for a long time, but you can't swim in that. So really perilous. So all right, we've kind of set the groundwork of what naval war was like, what the trading was like, what the relationships were like between the towns and the princes. So this war starts off after a series of other conflicts. The British had been involved on the Danish side with several conflicts with the Hans. Sometimes they took the Hans side too. Basically, they were just working for their own advantage, trying to get their merchants into the Baltic with limited success. But they were most powerful ally were the Dutch, and the Dutch were also very sophisticated in naval warfare and so on, and they had more success against the Hans. And so the British, kind of in collaboration with the Dutch, had gotten into the Baltic, but there were still lots and lots of conflicts, and a lot of the conflict had to do with the Øresund, which is this channel that connected the North Sea and the Baltic. And there was a series of little wars and ceasefires and treaties that were started out in the 1450s. This was kind of at the end of a previous series of skirmishes and battles that were going on that England and the Huns were engaged in. And in the early 1460s, some Danish privateers, Danish sort of state-sponsored pirates, seized some English vessels, and King Edward IV believed that the Hans was behind it. Whether that was the case, I have not been able to determine. But he ordered the goods of the Steelyard in London to be confiscated in 1468. So a mob of burghers from London eagerly stormed the facility. A bunch of the German merchants were arrested. All their stuff was robbed. Some of them were killed. You can see that part of the problem at this point is still the city, or the kingdom, even recognizing the cities as somebody worthy of negotiation with. And there's a letter here from the Hanseatic League to the English Privy Council in 1469 that I get from a historian called Philippa of England, and this is from his the German Hansa from pages 411 and 412. So the Hansa is almost like having to explain what they are here. So they say, the Hansa Teutonica is a firm confederatio of many cities, towns, and communities for the purpose of ensuring that business enterprises by land and sea should have a desired and favorable outcome, and that there should be effective protection against pirates and highwaymen, so that their ambushes do not rob merchants of their goods and valuables. So this is like, they're just trying to explain, we're the Hanseatic League, this is what we are, we're a bunch of merchants, we're just trying to make trade. There was piracy and privateering all the time in the North Sea and the Baltic, all the time, and sometimes this was like kind of a proxy war. The English engaged in it too, so did the Scots and the Irish and the Norwegians and the Danes, and sometimes the Hans did as well. There may be a little less than the others, because they were gaining advantage from a more orderly flow of trade. Anyway, after this letter went to the English, it did not have the desired effect. The English did not return the property or release the captive merchants. So they held a Hansetag, which is a meeting of the Hanseatic cities, in which Lubeck, Bremen, Danzig, and Hamburg all voted to go to war, while Cologne, which is another very large, powerful German city at this time on the Rhineland, Cologne had strong trade links with England, and they decided to opt out of the war, and as a result they were temporarily kicked out of the Hanseatic League, although that did not last. So at this point in 1470, the war was on. The Hanseatic cities had prepared several of their merchant ships they refitted them to be warships. So the city of Hamburg fielded the Great Mary and the Flying Ghost. That was two of their warships, which were basically upgunned cogs. The city of Lubeck had St. Mary's Dragon and St. George's Dragon. There was also a bunch of other smaller cogs and these hulks and Schnigge. And at this time, the war was being conducted mainly by a handful of the larger ships with support of a couple of dozen of the smaller ones. And this was essentially an enforced maritime blockade. On and off across the 4-year period, England was able to get the support of France, Burgundy, and the Flemish and Dutch cities that were theoretically ruled by Burgundy, although it was not always the case. They were often siding with the English. It kind of came and went, and there was a lot of diplomacy and sort of betrayals and such that went on between them. But it was really a side effect of the fact that the Hanseatic League was enforcing a blockade on England. So anybody that traded with England was subject to them being attacked, and the Hanseatic League was kind of getting the better in the fighting. However, the Flemish and the Dutch had good navies, as I had mentioned before. They had sophisticated ships, and the French had started building caravels, which are these multi-masted ships that they had caravel planking, so that instead of the overlapping lap straight construction of the older type ships, these had a tighter, flush construction of the planks, so they could handle rougher seas. They have multiple masts. They have the lateen sail. They're just bigger, so you can fit more guns on them. So as France gets involved in the war on and off, the Hans is having to fight these bigger and more effective warships, and they're just having to rely on being a little more cunning, a little better at ambushing and so forth. But it's creating a little bit of a disadvantage for them. So meanwhile, at the same time, one of these French merchant ships called Pierre de la Rochelle arrived in the city of Danzig, which is today Gdansk in Poland. And this was one of these big caravels. In fact, it was probably the biggest one France had made to that point. Certainly, it was the biggest one that had been seen in this part of what's now Poland, or any of the Hanseatic towns. And at this point, Danzig was involved in the war, but they didn't have any big warships. So they looked at this ship, which had arrived in 1462 and gotten damaged by lightning and was just sort of sitting in their harbor, and they ended up buying it from the family of the owner for 1,000 marks, and they put it into their shipyards, which were quite sophisticated, and refitted it as a warship in 1470, and they renamed this ship the Peter von Danzig. The first captain, the first skipper on that ship, was a guy called Bernard Pavest, and I think he was maybe a little bit. He was an experienced skipper, but a little old and not used to this type of ship, which is very different from the much smaller cogs that the Hanseatic skippers were used to in Hanseatic crews. He sailed that ship into the English Channel, where they had trouble. And if you know anything about the English Channel, the weather there is crazy. And the idea of taking these sailing ships that are mostly just using square sails and sailing around in the English Channel is kind of crazy. They actually beached twice in the English Channel during the first cruise, and there was things were going so badly that while they were anchored in the estuary of the river Zwin in what's now in Frisia, there was a little mutiny that they had to put down, and the damaged ship was taken to the shipyard in Bruges and had to be repaired, and it finally returned to Danzig in 1472. That's when this guy called Paul Benecke took over the command, and he was an experienced sailor and skipper who had been having a lot of success in the Anglo Hanseatic War already. But before that, he was involved in a naval battle at Bornholm in 1455, in which he wounded a skipper when he was just a teenager by hitting the guy with a boarding axe. And he was also involved in a raid at Arnholt in 1466, in which he apparently distinguished himself, mentioned in the dispatches kind of thing. And he had a lot of successes with captaining one of the ships from Lubeck. And I'm just going to read a little excerpt from a website called Electronic Scotland, which covers a lot of history of England and Scotland. Benecke was the skipper of the Marion Drake, which was the St. Mary's Dragon. It was one of the ships of Lubeck. And the following is from Electronic Scotland. In the following year, the Danzig naval hero managed a whole series of daring, almost unbelievable tricks against England. For example, he imprisoned the mayor of Dover after deceiving him by raising the French flag and luring him on board. He then set fire to no fewer than 18 merchant ships of England lying off the coast of France. A little later, Benecke sees French ships in the English Channel. There's no doubt about it. This is the fleet that has the Lord Mayor of London with him, who is returning from a visit to France. Benecke pounces on the ship, takes the English dignitaries prisoners, confiscates all British property, and then before they can grasp what has actually happened, he lets the French go again. Soon afterward, Benecke was informed of several English warships, including the St. John, their mighty flagship, lying off the Dutch coast. The Seabird sends two of his brave Danzigers who use cunning to get on board the English flagship and secretly pour liquid lead into the hinges of the rudder. That's almost like a nod to the famous incident in the Elbe estuary with the pirates. The next morning, Benecke approaches the English in a thick fog like the captain of a ghost ship, shoots up one of their ships, captures the second, and also takes the immobilized St. John. Paul Benecke then becomes the enemy's greatest terror when he takes command over one of the mightiest warships of the Hanseatic League, the Peter von Danzig. So that's what he did, and he had really caused a major problem with this new caravel, as the Germans called it, the Great Caravel. Here we have the entrance of the Florentines. So the city of Florence had a banking outlet in the city of Bruges, in what's now Belgium on the coast. And Bruges was a very large, very important, very wealthy trading city that had kind of a fraught relationship with the Hans. They had a major Hanseatic outpost in Bruges, but they were also often clashing with the Hanseatic towns. And in this case, the Medici agent for Bruges, which was who was running the bank there, was a guy called Thomas Portinari, and he had been loaning a lot of money to the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, who he was kind of making a bet on, and he had a big shipment of very valuable cargo, including silk textiles and a bunch of other stuff, brought up from Florence. And these had come on two heavily armed galleys, the St. Andrew and the St. George. Specifically, they had left port in Pisa and had just landed in Bruges. And they were intending to continue to London. This was a perilous decision because London was under embargo by the Hans at the time. Paul Benecke got wind of this and spotted the two ships. Now, these were fairly powerful warships, but they decided not to engage, and they tried to flee down the coast. He managed to corner the St. Andrew, and they got into a brisk firefight, and his crew, which was rather large on the Peter von Danzig, there was 300 soldiers as well as 50 sailors, and large amount of guns that were on the ship. They were able to overcome the Florentine galley and capture it. And this is a depiction that was created by Medieval World Magazine for an article that I did for them. That was a couple years ago. It's in issue 14. I'll have a link to that at the end of this. And this was sort of the culmination of the war, because the next year the English king signed the Treaty of Utrecht with the Hans, and the steel yard was reinstated. The loot from this ship, the St. Andrew, part of it was divided up amongst the sailors because of sort of the pirate rule. There was a certain amount of shares that were given, but the bulk of it, aside from the triptych by Hans Memling, which we'll talk about in just a second, was tied up in lawsuits for decades. And this is a side of sort of piracy, and even going back to the Vikings, that people tend to ignore and overlook, is that lawsuits, things getting caught up in court was very much a thing. Paul Benecke eventually died in 1480. They believe that it was from typhus. The Peter von Danzig warship, after the war was all over, was visiting La Rochelle back in the capacity as a merchant ship again, when ironically it was hit by lightning, which is kind of how it got started. That's how it went from being French to Hanseatic, and it was destroyed in that case. Thomas Portinari, the Medici agent for Bruges, had lent huge amounts of money to Charles the Bold, as I mentioned, and the Medici Bank in Bruges went bankrupt as a result after Charles the Bold died in the Battle of Nancy against the Swiss and Rhineland towns in 1477 during the Burgundian Wars, which is going to be covered in another video I'm going to do pretty soon. The Medici's bank, in fact, did not do that well by the end of the 15th century. However, soon in the 16th century, with the intervention of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the Medici ended up becoming the princely rulers of Florence, and Florence was no longer a republic, and it just became their fiefdom. And this is pretty much when the great flowering and Renaissance of Florence ended, sadly. So this wonderful painting that was captured ended up in Danzig. This is the Memling triptych of the Last Judgment. Hans Memling was a German who had arrived in Bruges and apprenticed, or was a journeyman under Roger van der Weyden, and he was made a citizen of Bruges in 1465. He was listed under the 875 richest citizens of Bruges during a tax roll in 1480, when the city was basically being shaken down by Maximilian I after the death of
Charles the Bold and the end of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy. Uh, he specialized in doing donor portraits, and in this wonderful triptych, you can see kind of on the center left the people being weighed just in the scales of St. Michael here are, in fact, Thomas Portinari, the Medici agent of Bruges, and his wife, Portinari had commissioned the great painting. If you look over on the right, there's an interesting detail that you'll see that a lot of people burning in hell there have the tonsures of priests. And I read a Dutch art website that suggested that Memling was a bit of a drinker, and that he had some conflicts with some of the Dominicans in the city over maybe some of his behavior. And this is certainly something that happened to his patron and the person who trained him, which is Roger van der Weyden. He had a lot of trouble like that. But that these are supposedly Dominican priests and friars burning in hell as kind of a joke. And supposedly he also put a couple of his artist friends on that side of the painting, as a joke, but maybe a little bit less barbed of a joke. I don't know if this is true, because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of concrete facts about Memling's life, but it's an amusing story, and you can definitely see that the people burning in hell mostly have these special haircuts, the tonsure, that friars and Dominican priests also had. The Memling triptych ended up in Gdansk, and it's still there. It's a massive painting. It's 7 feet high by 10 feet wide. The London merchant adventurers who had been trying to break into the trading in the Baltic gradually did get into trading in Scandinavia, in Livonia, which is the Baltic states, and in northern Germany. There are records complaining about these people as being annoying peddlers. They're knocking on people's door trying to sell junk, but that might just be rivalry, rivalry speaking itself. There eventually became a little colony of English and Scottish traders in the city that's called Elblag now, and it used to be called Elbing, which is one of the Prussian cities in what's now northern Poland. And the heyday of the English merchants started under the reign of Henry VIII and really took off under the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And it was Queen Elizabeth who finally shut down and evicted the German merchants and shut down the steel yard. The Hans suffered as the world trade moved into the Atlantic and the Pacific, because in order to get to the Atlantic and the Pacific, they had to get through both the Øresund and the English Channel. And so they were sort of blocked. And the Hans probably hit their peak of power in the mid-16th century when they created a massive warship called the Adler von Lubeck, which was 3,000 tons and 138 cannon. And one day I'd like to do a little video as a thought experiment, kind of looking at this ship, which was really ferocious for its time, like a really massive, scary warship, versus one of the warships of the Napoleonic era, and kind of get like as just sort of a thought experiment and see, compare them gun for gun, and in every detail. But the Adler von Lubeck never did get in a war. They built it for a war that was starting up, and by the time the ship was ready, it was over. The Hanseatic League didn't last that much longer than the 16th century, but however, the individual cities in it remained quite formidable, especially these key cities that were involved in the Anglo Hanseatic War: Danzig, Lubeck, Hamburg, and Bremen. Cologne, too, which had stayed out of the war. These were all quite potent, powerful cities that remained autonomous for centuries. Bremen lasted until Napoleon invaded in 1803. Hamburg was briefly taken over by Napoleon, but was reinstituted as a autonomous town, and that continued until the 1880s. And even today, it has now been made into essentially its own little federal state in Germany, and it likes to call itself the Free Hanseatic City of Hamburg. Lubeck lost their autonomy in 1937 when they refused to let Hitler speak there. They had refused to let him speak a year earlier, and when he came into power, he had passed a law that took away all the last of their special rights as kind of a quasi-city-state. Gdansk is a major port in Poland today. It's been beautifully rebuilt after World War II,
And there's a lot of really amazing architecture from the heyday of Gdansk as a Hanseatic town. It's worth noting that Gdansk was the epicenter of the Solidarity movement that helped take down the Soviet Union. The special force of these places still exerts itself, and they're really unique and interesting places to visit if you ever get the chance. The wonderful painting that is featured prominently in this video was created by Medieval World Magazine for an article that I wrote for issue 14. They are not a sponsor of this. I don't have any sponsors. I just wanted to mention it because it's a great piece of art that I love seeing this to me very accurate depiction of what the scene really looked like, and you can see the wonderful triptych there on the ship. They're opening up and looking at what they've just caught, and I like the magazine. I'm a subscriber for many years, and there's really good stuff in it. It's a mix of academic people and independent researchers like myself. There's a lot of HEMA folks that write articles for them. And yeah, so we can come back out of this. What does it all mean? Well, it was a relatively short war, but it had a long impact. The Hanseatic League had this outpost in London for another 100 years, and they had all these special rights and privileges that were asserted by force, by the towns that usually got involved in force only as a last resort. They really preferred not to fight. If they could ever avoid it, they were good at diplomacy. They could usually smooth things over, but every once in a while they had to fight, and they quite often did well when they had to do it because they had these certain advantages. They knew their trade. These people knew the seas extremely well, and so this is the type of story, these town versus crown stories, that I'm going to be getting into a little bit more going forward. I'm going to have links to all the stuff. A bunch of articles, little wikis and so on that you can follow up on if you're interested. A lot of the things that I mentioned, specific ships, there's some replicas that they've built that are really cool that you can look at. Stuff about the steel yard, the Boner family. I'm also a game designer, and I run a little game company called Codex Integrum. And you can look at the games on DriveThruRPG and on our own website. I'll post links to those as well. And anyway, I hope you liked it, and hope you'll come back and check out our next one. And the next one's probably going to be about the Burgundian Wars between the Swiss and Burgundy.